I mean, when you're 20, like you really do think you're going to just change the entire world.
Yeah.
With what you're doing. So there's a bit of like hubris, there's a bit of ego, there's a bit of naivete. Like that's just such a magical time in life. And I don't think back on it like, oh my gosh, I'm not 20 anymore. I just think, wow, we did it to the fullest.
Hello, my name is Kay Anderson, and you are listening to Lost Spaces, the podcast that mourns the death of queer nightlife. Every episode, I talk to a different person about a venue from their past, the memories they created there, and the people that they used to know. My guest on this week's show is Jordan King, a Canadian multi-disciplinary artist, archivist, and historian, with her personal work currently focused on the overlap of drag culture and trans female identity. And she is also the host of her own podcast, Radio Never Apart, for Montreal's online magazine, Never Apart. And we are heading back in time to the early noughties. This is the time when the Spice Girls were unraveling. We had email, but not social media, and not even MySpace. I mean, can you even remember that far back? And Electroclash was at its peak. It was at this time that Jordan and a small group of friends started to host a weekly party in the then recently renovated basement of the Lotus Hotel in Vancouver. We talk all about the subtle difference between being a ringleader and being a wrangler, Jordan's casting in the Hollywood film Connie and Carla, and the magic and the chaos of throwing yourself headfirst into something that you're passionate about.
I moved to Vancouver in 1999.
From where?
With my boyfriend at the time, from Vancouver Island.
Oh, okay.
So Vancouver Island it's about an hour and a half ferry ride, but it's like a massive island. I mean, I think it's like the size of Ireland, maybe. I don't know. I'm speculating, but it's huge, right?
No one looked that up. It's the size of Ireland.
I know. I know. It's just a huge island. It's got, cities with over 1 million like multiple cities with over 1 million people living on it. So it's, but it wasn't like a little teeny tiny island, but it was still a big jump across to the big city from the smaller town that I was living in. And I moved with my boyfriend at the time in 1999.
Full of hopes and dreams.
To Vancouver, to the big city. Exactly. I had my one duffel bag packed, I think.
Oh.
That was it.
And I'm not going to labor on this, but how long did the relationship last once you got to Vancouver?
We're actually still quite close friends to this day.
Okay, but that didn't answer my question.
We were together in a relationship for, I would say, about 2 years.
Okay. Oh, so it didn't just like disintegrate within 3 weeks?
No, definitely not.
Well, you weren't doing it right then.
I mean, and I want to say maybe 17 or 18.
Wow.
There actually was a point in time in which I remember thinking, is this what happens? You just marry this person, or obviously marriage wasn't even on my mind. I mean, are you kidding me? But it was sort of like, is this just it? I'm now committed to this person and we just kind of make this work. And then I had that, late adolescent, I wasn't even a fully formed human yet. Sort of like, oh my gosh, wait, no, like there's so much I haven't done. There's so much I haven't experienced, right? And also this was pre-transition, but it basically began as soon as I arrived in Vancouver, if I'm honest with you. So in that dynamic, I mean, I knew it also wasn't really a fit because he still identifies as a gay person and I now identify as a trans person, and transitioned really quite shortly after arriving in Vancouver. No.
That must have been really tough, like in terms of...
It wasn't really, because that relationship just sort of almost switched in this really natural, totally logical way to be less like we were in a couple and more like we were just kind of best friends.
Oh, okay.
And I think that can happen for a lot of people, or, I don't know. I mean, I guess, I don't know if I could say a lot, but I think it does happen for some people in queer relationships where maybe sexually you're no longer compatible, or you've had lots of fun and you've had lots of experiences. And then maybe one or both of you are a little bit like, maybe something's kind of fizzling out a little bit, but you really also just like dig each other and have lots of fun together in the context of your relationship. And so you either like open it up or you break up, but you stay friends, or, I think there's lots of possibilities there. It doesn't have to be like a big breakup that you're going to just sort of walk away from it. So yeah, I'm still quite close with that person, and we stayed close. Really, we've been close ever since. I mean, that was over 20 years ago. It just really wasn't like we were a romantic couple as I began to transition. It just was sort of like, oh yeah, well, cool, now we're best friends. I mean,
yeah, and like, I mean, that sounds very, very healthy. I guess my experience of relationships at that age is like, let's just be rigid and like expect this perfect thing from each other that neither of us can provide, and then if we don't give it, it's a total failure on both of our parts.
It's so heteronormative, and I find it so fascinating because I still talk to people where I just think, wow, we're so lucky as queer people. That's how I see it anyways, to really just kind of define our existence in our own way, define our relationships in our own way. So, I mean, gay marriage, same-sex marriage became legal in Canada in 2003, which is quite early comparatively speaking to other parts of the world. But I also can't say that I necessarily aspired to be like married in a white picket fence sort of a sense. Although I am married now. That's another interesting part. I've been married for 7 years almost.
7 years. Oh, wow. I don't know what I've done for 7 years.
And we've been together. My husband and I have been together for almost 15 years.
No. Oh,
I know. And I just look like I'm only 12, right?
15 years. Wow. That's an achievement. But so, okay, so I want to pick up on the thing that you said about not having to aspire to this heteronormative idea of what a relationship is. Because I think that like for a lot of, I mean, I agree, I totally agree. But for a lot of people, if you grew up in a culture that is heteronormative and at a time, like, if we're saying in 2000, when there aren't very many alternatives offered to you through culture, through media, then I can see why people are just like, well, I guess this is what I'm supposed to do as well.
Totally. And I still have conversations with friends who I would consider to be very progressive, who live in cool cities like Berlin, where there's lots of people doing things that are progressive and kind of crafting their own realities, who will make comments sometimes, and I just think, oh my goodness, like, wow, it's a lot of us are still stuck in certain concepts of what a relationship or a marriage or a partnership is sort of supposed to look like. And I just think to myself, who on earth created this supposed to? And maybe it's just that I had cool friends from a very young age who were defining their queer relationships on their own terms, and who introduced me to like some really incredible reading at that time. So again, we're talking like 20 years ago, that I just, I sort of questioned a lot of that stuff.
Yeah, I don't think I questioned it until quite a while later.
I mean, in England, I think there's certain things that are a bit more traditional, right? And there's certain expectations.
So hang on. So what, you're schooling me on the UK? Come on. So what?
No, not at all. But I have friends who are British, and I know that some of those traditions there, they run deep.
Like what? Compared to Canada?
I mean, we're speaking in such broad terms. I mean, I've only just met you. I don't know.
Okay, well, anyway, so the theme here is I lived a sheltered existence, but DJs. We were talking about DJs, DJ culture shifting.
DJ
People who were playing
culture.
vinyl were suddenly uncool.
Well, they were still seen as really cool, but it just in terms of nightlife, a lot of things were sort of changing really rapidly. And so, I mean, I think what I'm most interested to talk about is this space, the Lotus Hotel, and also what this time was like in Vancouver nightlife, because it was just prior to many other big changes happening, right? So it was pre-social media. And Vancouver as a city is sort of, there's lots of things about it that are quite unique. So it has what's called an entertainment district now. And at the time that I was most heavily involved in nightlife, this didn't exist yet. So they were in the process of creating this one sort of central street in the downtown core that was going to be this entertainment district. And they wanted all the nightclubs to be there.
Ah, okay.
Just sort of create this like Las Vegas Strip kind of idea where it was really like, and in their minds, I think, from what I recall reading at the time, they wanted it to be easier to police and to sort of monitor if it was all in one place was, I think, the logic. Although, again, I wasn't necessarily involved with it. I just remember watching this all happening over that time period around early 2000s, and that's the direction it was starting to go, was to move everything there.
And so prior to that, like, how spread out is the city, and was the nightlife spread out in a way you would expect a city that naturally grew?
Vancouver's sort of, again, it's quite an odd city. It's almost, the downtown is on a little peninsula almost, right? And there's Stanley Park, which lots of people are familiar with. It's this beautiful, massive, sprawling sort of urban park right adjacent to the downtown, on the same little peninsula of land almost. It's sort of tiny. But there was always traditionally a divide between sort of the east side and then the downtown core. So East Vancouver were sort of maybe what people who are British might, or people who live in London might think of as like East London.
Okay.
That it was a bit sort of more like rough or experimental. And that was sort of where the more artsy, sort of cool stuff was happening. And it was a bit dodgier. And then in the more central part of downtown, obviously there's the sort of towers and the commerce focused sort of area. And then there was the gay village, which is Davie Street. It's also fairly well known. And so there was kind of a divide in that some of the, queer folks who lived on the east side didn't go down to Davie Street as much. And if you were living on like Davie Street or living in the West End, you hung out a lot on Davie Street. And although they're not geographically far at all, we're not even talking the distance between like East London and like Soho. It's like shorter distance than that. But people just wouldn't really cross over. And the other thing that's unique about Vancouver is that the downtown east side is an area people might have heard of because it's still to this day experiencing major problems with homelessness, drug use in full open view, despite being within a couple of blocks of the police headquarters. And I think there's a lot of reasons why that is the situation there. I mean, partly it's because it's historically for over 100 years been an area where people who were sort of, I'm using air quotes here, like disenfranchised, were living, residing, making their homes there. So that history is quite embedded in that area. There also just has, in my opinion, not been a wonderful management of, I guess, people who are experiencing mental health issues and stuff. It's really sort of created this snowball effect that now here we are 2021. I mean, it's still a massive problem in Vancouver that area is basically door to door with fancy shopping and people who are very visibly dealing with mental health issues and using drugs out in the open every single day. So, I mean, it creates a sort of bit of a dangerous feeling, I guess, if you're not someone who's like from there, and they might even advise tourists, like, don't go down that street because it might be scary and stuff. but that's just a part of the downtown of Vancouver. So from that standpoint too, the nightlife that was happening in East Vancouver or in the Gastown area was always seen as being a little bit more like on the fringe, or like a little bit more on the perimeter of, these areas that people would see as more sort of scary or something. But it's where a lot of the cooler nightlife was, right? Like more of the sort of interesting venues were in that part of downtown.
Because the rent was so cheaper, assumedly. And
Yeah. And so this, when we started to throw our party, it was prior to the Granville Street sort of entertainment district being even in existence yet. So nightlife was spread out a bit more so. And there just would be like little pockets here and there of places that people might go out, and especially for different types of nightlife. I mean, in Gastown, there were a lot of much larger electronic music venues, which don't exist now, I don't think. But there was sort of cool stuff in that vicinity. And so the Lotus Hotel was this historic hotel, and it had been called the Heritage House Hotel in the 1980s. And they were sort of beginning in the 90s to start to try to program it a little bit differently, because my understanding, and I even at that time was quite interested in like nightlife history, was that it had been sort of a queer hangout. There would be maybe fetish parties there periodically. Lots of lesbian events had been going on there. But those venues had been there for like over 20 years. And then they started in the 90s to program more electronic music in this basement space and do like a weekend party that was maybe attempting to kind of draw a bit more of a mainstream crowd. And on Tuesdays, they had a drum and bass night, which I used to go to in the basement space. But what's also quite fascinating about it is that it was actually 3 distinct spaces. So there was the Lotus, was sort of the basement venue. And then there was a pretty spacious pub sort of venue right directly on the corner. And the intersection is Hastings and Abbott. And then there was a slightly smaller sort of little pub almost that was just up from the corner. And so those venues in all through the 80s and 90s, the corner space had been called Charlie's Lounge. And then the smaller little pub had been called Chuck's Pub. And the basement, I think, had always been called the Lotus.
And so it was all like part of one building.
Yes, they were all interconnected by these corridors, which I got to then sort of learn about and see the whole inside of it, really, because so they made the decision that, I guess, the building owners in around 2001 to completely sort of renovate or give it a facelift, rebrand it. So I think just my little cohort of friends, those of us that were involved in throwing this party, I think we just sort of struck at the right time, because it was our first time organizing anything on our own. We'd all been involved peripherally in different parts of nightlife prior to doing this party, but essentially we had carte blanche to do whatever we wanted, because they were going to be renovating the space. They wanted to bring in younger promoters, new talent, new organizers, performers, any of this kind of stuff. And I mean, we were given free rein. I mean, we weren't given any money to do anything.
Okay, well, that's the downside.
But we were told we could do whatever we wanted. And the rebranding of the spaces was as Milk and Honey, Milk being the smaller space just up from the corner, and then Honey Lounge was what they named the space right on the corner.
Honey Lounge. It's so cheesy, isn't it? So I want to find out more about you and your friends then. So, like, how did you have the conversation that was like, shall we do something together?
I mean, I don't really remember there ever being a conscious, like, sort of meeting where we all decided, okay, who's going to do what or how this is going to be organized. There really wasn't a structure per se. I think I was probably the most motivated to try to do something and bring everybody together. But I wasn't necessarily, like, it wasn't solely on my shoulders by any stretch. We really were kind of a little collective almost. And So it was my very dear friend Preston, who, again, is someone I'm still friends with to this day, Preston Buffalo. And he and I think, were sort of the sort of creative force, I guess, a little bit in terms of envisioning what the flyers and stuff might look like. So we worked a lot on that side of it. And then we had a friend, Jason, who was a DJ. His DJ name was Eddie Toon Flash.
Sorry.
And so, I mean, we all had these little sort of quirky names, and then we had another friend named Joshua who was going to be our MC. And I mean, a lot of us worked sort of in proximity to one another, and we just knew each other through nightlife. I mean, again, there wasn't sort of a meeting where we all decided like, hey, we're all going to do this. It really just sort of happened. I mean,
and there was no ringleader, or was that your role?
I mean, I guess I would be I probably would have been the closest to a sort of wrangler, but I would refer to myself as a wrangler more so than a ringleader.
Oh, okay. And how would you differentiate the two terms?
Well, I see a ringleader to me is really somebody who wants to like lead the charge, be in charge. And I didn't ever necessarily want to be the sort of, sole person responsible for it per se. I love collaboration. I think that collaboration is where the most exciting creative stuff happens in any sort of creative endeavor. So we all contributed, right? And so, although I was definitely, like I said, I was probably the most motivated, and I would have loved to have seen it grow and continue. I mean, they're just, we'll get to this part, I'm sure, in terms of the evolution of it, because we did it for over a year and a half, but I think I had the most sustained energy around it.
Okay. I mean, basically, I'm just pushing you in this direction because I want to moan about people who aren't motivated. So I like, in whatever dynamic I'm in, I always end up being the person who's like, come on, everyone, come on, we got to do this now. We got to do this now. And it's like, I just feel like I'm the biggest nag in the world.
You know what I will say? I will say this. It's something that I've learned in my years of wisdom is that when things start to kind of move and when things can start to really happen is I think when you connect with, and if it's just organically or if it's because someone says, I think you should know this person because I feel like you're going to really like each other. When you have people that want to move at a similar pace to what you do, that's when exciting stuff can happen.
So what do you do when they don't want to move?
I mean, I think it's totally okay to say you do you. I mean, there's so many people out there in the world, and you just kind of got to keep staying open to meeting new people and talking to new people and keep putting your projects out there into the world and stuff.
Yeah.
I mean,
well, I think like I've always been similar to you in that like I want something to be bigger than me. So I want something that like involves other people and like brings the strengths from other people. And then I just always end up being the one that's like, okay, everyone, I've got my checklist here and this needs to be done by this time and this needs to be done by this time. And everyone's like, yeah, no, I'm not interested. Sorry.
Well, I do feel for you because I will say that it can be frustrating to have an idea. And I mean, I literally just said this, right? And to want to continue with it or to want to see it get better or to want to see it grow and to just have no one else that's involved really be sort of matching that enthusiasm. I mean, it can be really frustrating, but I think it's also okay to sort of let something lie for a little bit or to walk away from it for a while.
Yes. Okay. So sorry, this isn't a therapy session for me.
No, I mean, it's good. It's all interesting reflection for me.
So you don't remember like having that conversation with the three others about setting the night up. Do you remember having the conversation with the venue?
Yes, that I remember for sure because I'm also still in contact with the person that sort of made that happen. And it did feel like quite a grand meeting in which I sat down with her, and she is now living in London.
Did you bring a PowerPoint presentation?
This was, I think, 2001. I mean, it was all very like, we sat down and had like lunch in this super chic restaurant.
Oh.
And kind of did like a handshake to be like, yeah, let's do this.
Oh. So it was like a proper business meeting. Did you dress up for it?
I'm sure I did. Okay, this was over 20 years ago. I mean, I just remember it feeling really grown up to me because we also had never done anything like this before. So the fact that someone who was going to be the promotions manager of this venue that was being renovated and it was going to be a brand new space in this historic hotel, I think I just thought, am I missing something? Like, how on earth are they giving us this opportunity to just have our own night and give us a bar tab and let us keep the door? I mean, it just seemed...
They let you keep the door.
Sort of
they didn't take any
unbelievable.
cut from it.
Now, keep in mind, we on average would probably have maybe 20 people show up every week.
Oh, okay.
Probably half of whom were our friends on our guest list. So it's not like it was some sort of resoundingly successful thing. I mean, I think that their vision for that space was probably a bit grand, and it had some organizational issues of its own, even as it got going. So that person that I had a meeting with to set this all up, put this in motion, get the yes, you're going to have Thursday night, all this stuff, she didn't stay on pretty much the second they opened the physical space. Somebody had replaced her. So they were then sort of stuck with us, even though maybe they wouldn't have chosen to let this like totally disorganized group of 20-year-olds throw a weekly party in their space.
Well, so they were...
But they were stuck with us.
you.
So.
And so what happened? Like, so the first night?
Well, the space itself was so stunningly beautiful that... I think we were the very first night that it was even open to the public, happened to be a Thursday, so it happened to be our night. So I remember going into the space and just thinking, like, I can't believe this is even real. So they'd completely gutted the interiors of each of those venues, but they had really done it in quite a beautiful way. And I'm not a huge fan of like a gut reno that just strips everything away. And I'm sure lots of people who had been longtime patrons were horrified because it had been quite sort of beautifully dingy prior to that. And when we went in, it was all completely white, and they had actually pressed milk bottles, like glass milk bottles, into the wall to create this like repeating pattern motif that were then painted white. So it was sort of meant to feel like a milk bottle, and it was called Milk Bar, and it had a beautiful fireplace. It had these big pillars, which were obviously structural, but they didn't totally ruin the sightlines per se to the stage. And there was a small-ish stage, but still a very decently sized one when I think sort of now about the number of stages I've seen that are basically just like little risers. Yeah. I mean, it was like a nice proper sized stage. It had, candles on each of the little low-rise tables. It was quite a chic space. I just remember thinking I couldn't believe it was ours to have our night in.
And so did the imposter syndrome kick in at any stage, or were you just like riding the wave?
I think it kicked in when I realized that really none of us had any experience actually presenting a show.
Oh, okay.
So I had wanted to just be a performer. I didn't really want to be an organizer. And I had been performing, to some extent over the year leading up to that, but never really sort of headlining my own show. And granted, I didn't have the sort of ego to think that I could even carry a show myself. I mean, I was 20 or 21, 20. I was only 20 years old. So we were a whole lineup. There was a whole sort of group of us that were going to be performing. But our MC hadn't really like emceed shows before. So that was when I think it kicked in to sort of say like, well, we actually really don't even have any organizational skills surrounding like putting on a proper cabaret show that has somebody who's going to host it and kind of guide the pacing of the night. We just were all sort of showing up and lip syncing to songs.
The MC role is so underrated. It's so difficult. I don't know how anyone does it, because I'm just like, hello, would you all like me, please? But I mean, that never works.
And ironically enough, the person who MC'd our show still is a drag performer, has since gone on to become a phenomenal host of shows and a performer in their own right. But at the time, I basically begged them to do it. They didn't really say, oh, I would love to host the show or I'd love to MC the show. And it was even during the first 6 months, I think, that they then started to perform themselves, whereas in the beginning, they just MC'd.
Oh, okay.
And so my very dear friend Joshua, I mean, we're still extremely close to this day as well. His drag name was and still is Teen Jesus Barbie. Because he sort of looked at the time like this beautiful androgynous Jesus figure, but we were all sort of like babies. I mean, 20. So his drag name became Teen Jesus Barbie.
And he still got that name.
He still goes by that drag name to this day. And he worked at a vintage shop. So on a lot of our posters, we credited our sponsors. I mean, we'll use the term sponsor quite loosely because basically in agreement to put their logo on our posters, I mean, so the shop he worked at was one of our sponsors and we were allowed to go pick out outfits the day of the show. And we would give them back the next day and they would go back out on the sales floor. And it was this phenomenal vintage shop in Vancouver. I mean, so beautifully curated. And Burju, if she's listening, she still is running a vintage shop.
But how stressful was that then, like on the day, like having to get the outfit?
I just honestly remember it being so fun. It was like going in and just deciding who we were going to be that night and just trying on a whole mass of clothes. Our pictures were up in the change rooms for the longest time. She was sort of like our little fairy godmother almost, to just let us pick out outfits on the day of and then go out that night and wear them out. I mean, what a dream.
Did you ever ruin any of the outfits though?
No.
Ah.
Yeah, truly no. I can honestly say we took really good care of them.
And at that time, were people smoking inside
yes,
venues?
Yeah.
So you returned them all like skanky and...
Well, I mean, I'm someone who takes exceptional care of my vintage now, and I do have a wonderful collection of vintage that I appreciate so much. I don't think I was probably returning them all smoky and sweaty. I mean, we would wear them for the number, so sort of like being allowed to borrow our costumes for the number. Mm-mm. But you know what else, Kay, you're reminding me, is I think Burju would even smoke inside her store at that time. So it was sort of one of those kinds of vintage shops. It was a bit like... it was quite incredible, but it wasn't like going into, say, like Relic in London or something where you have to buzz to be let in. I mean, it was a bit... I
don't even know what that is. I'm just like...
It's very elite and exclusive vintage.
You're far more bougie than me.
Well, I am and I'm not, because I would also be wearing those costumes and returning them the next day.
But see, that's the thing. Like, so it was your performance. If you'd already picked out your performance, you already kind of knew what your character was for that performance, and then you couldn't find an outfit that matched that. I'm overthinking this.
She had so much. Yeah, she had so much to choose from. Honestly, it was packed. It was just one of those incredible, brilliant vintage shops that I don't know. I mean, I think to some extent they exist in some places. I mean, it's still my favorite kind of vintage shop to go into personally, where there's just sort of so much to look through and sift through. Also back then, I mean, it wasn't as picked over. We found incredible stuff. And we each had our own aesthetic. So I will say that, I was sort of, envisioning myself as this like Parisian showgirl, Josephine Baker, maybe like that's so it's like, even if we didn't necessarily know the exact costume or character we were going to be, we each sort of were starting to hone our brands a little bit. And, Teen Jesus Barbie would wear sort of
caftans,
poofy prom dresses. Maybe a caftan even. I mean, it was all very experimental. Joshua, a lot of the time, had facial hair, but he would be like full glam facial hair. It was always his own real hair that would be like styled into this like incredible, I mean, yeah.
And so what was your first performance then on that first night?
Goldfinger by Shirley Bassey.
A classic.
And I remember that I was wearing this gold sequined dress, and it was probably even, I guess, my first ever even attempt at a burlesque act, because I think that I did like a reveal to take off the gold sequin dress. I don't really remember what I had on underneath. But that sort of is like loosely in my mind. But, you know, again, it was tricky because I didn't really want to be an organizer as much as I wanted to be a performer.
Mm-hmm.
And yet our only way to make this happen was for us all to be simultaneously organizers and promoters and performers and, you know.
Mm-mm.
So I could never put as much into my performances as I wanted. I also was probably the only one that would go and rehearse in the space.
The only person that took it seriously at all, it sounds like. And so by that, do you mean like because there were so many other things in your mind, you couldn't like focus on the performance as much?
Yes, definitely.
Well, and at that point, like, so you said that you'd been performing for about a year up until that point. Did you have specific aspirations around performing, or was it just a way of expressing yourself?
I think it was a lot about sort of identity discovery.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I dreamt of being able to be a successful performer, although at the time I don't think I had any example of necessarily what that would mean or what that sort of would have looked like to have become successful, I guess. And the thing is that Vancouver is really sort of a small city in North America.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And in particular, like Canada and the west coast of Canada, you're removed from a lot of other opportunities and things that are going on. And even like Montreal or Toronto, I mean, there was a big separation at the time. So I think I was having fun with it. I think I was dreaming big at the time, for sure. And I also was sort of learning about myself, understanding myself. And it was pre sort of any formal announcement that I was going to transition medically, but I essentially from the second I arrived in Vancouver started to present quite androgynously and also just have fun. Like I had honestly so much fun just experimenting and exploring and just discovering myself a little bit. So I still say that I discovered myself on stage because it was really through that period of time performing and also performing with such freedom. I mean, we had no expectations placed on us. And we had a really devoted group of sort of fans, I will say, which was teeny tiny. I mean, it was a really small little group, but that came to, I think, every single one of our shows, almost every single week, that we started to create this little, just this, you know, it's like a little circle of friends from among those people as well.
So as the night evolved and like, you know, week after week and you were doing performance after performance, did the plate spinning become easier, or was it always this kind of mishmash of responsibilities that you were thinking about?
Well, we ran it as a weekly party for, I think, really only about 6 months. And then I think we all started to lose steam a little bit with just how much goes into doing something weekly. And, you know, I think about just how much you'd be learning from doing it weekly. I mean, we learned tons, but then I think we just all did quickly feel like, well, this is not sustainable. And, you know, we were getting so little out of it financially that I think none of us really were like that keen to be putting as much into it as we were in the very beginning, because we sometimes took home like $20 each. Like, if I'm totally honest, right? Like, you know, so then it became a monthly event. So that worked in some ways. We would make them a little bit splashier because we were only doing it once a month. And then it sort of became like, goes from like weekly to monthly to then like there was a Pride event. Yeah. And then it was like, and then I think in about 2003, we sort of all just were burnt out of it.
And so that decision that initial decision to go from weekly to monthly, were you on board, or were you like feel a bit put upon?
I mean, I think I knew even at that time that we just couldn't really, I mean, weekly is really, really tough if you don't have a whole group of really strong performers that I think want to commit to be making that something really exciting. And I think the audience can tell too. And because of where this venue was located, so close to the downtown east side, it was very difficult for us to draw any sort of a mainstream crowd or even like a more sort of West End Davie Street gay crowd. It just was seen as being so far away. I mean, it makes me laugh almost because I'm like, it's really just sort of across the downtown. But we just knew it was never going to sort of take off. And so it was like, at what point does it not just seem like, well, this is a really exhausting, expensive hobby that I love. And I mean, I continued performing really up until 2007, quite regularly in Vancouver.
And then you left Vancouver in 2007.
Well, that was when I started to step back a little bit from nightlife. And
wait. Let me do the maths. 15
minute.
years ago, you met your husband. Oh, all right. I'm with you.
And I can also look at that as a real benchmark moment in time where like I met my husband and I just knew that for myself, there was a certain ceiling in Vancouver and there's just, there's certain limits on really what you could do as a performer. And I wasn't interested. I mean, zero shade whatsoever. We're all hustling to make our living in this world, but I was not going to do corporate gigs or bachelorette parties. Or,
and why is that?
Any of this kind of stuff that I just, I don't know. It just wasn't what I wanted to do with my, I guess, my craft as a performer. And I was doing burlesque when I stepped away. And I think I was also really doing it to the best sort of level that I could possibly do it with what I had access to at the time in Vancouver. I was sort of more okay with the idea of stepping away from it than having to sort of try to sell out in order to make it my livelihood, I guess.
And so was it this conscious decision, like, I am going to step away from this? Or was it more of a like, oh, I've not got any gigs booked for the time being. I'm not going to like actively pursue them. And then things just became more and more infrequent.
There was a few things that happened that year. So one was that I put together a show that I just put like blood, sweat, tears, heart and soul into. I poured way too much money into props and, all this, that, and the other. And although some really wonderful people came and saw it and I think enjoyed it and might remember it, it was like financially such a flop that I just remember sort of realizing like where I envisioned taking this just may not be possible in Vancouver. So there was a conscious decision to say like, I really aimed high and kind of, I didn't like lose my shirt. I mean, it was a huge chunk of money and logistically it was super complicated to try to pull off. And there were so many challenges with it that I just remember feeling like, well, maybe I've done what I set out to do with this in Vancouver, that paired with, being in a serious relationship with someone. And also, if you're following the timeline, this is right around the time that social media started to become really omnipresent, right? And I also, I participate in social media. It's hard to be part of our generation and not if you're, lots of people don't, but it's it's part of our lives now. But I just remember feeling like the kind of performance that I was doing, I just didn't think even at the time that it would maybe translate or that I necessarily wanted that out there on like the internet or...
okay. Oh, that's super interesting. I want to talk about that feeling of, this is my word and not your word, but failure that comes with something that you invest so much energy and time and money into. And if you're like a trust fund kid, it doesn't really matter, like the monetary return, does it? And you can focus on other things that measure the success of that endeavor. But when you're not a trust fund kid and you grew up in cultures that we grew up in, where money is a measure of success, it's really hard to do those things and step away and not feel like a failure if it doesn't wash its own face. which kind of more and more I'm starting to realize is a lie that I'm telling myself if
Yes.
that happens. Like if it brings
Yes.
me joy, and if it, I mean, this is super cheesy to say, if it touches 2 or 3 people, then I've done my job. But like,
100%.
yeah, like it's being present and being seen and like acknowledging that you have a voice. That's the most important. But like, I'm totally with you. And I've had projects in the past where I've put so much into it. And then, my marketing hasn't been right, or this hasn't been right. And so it hasn't connected with people in a way that I wanted it to. And so I've just come away thinking, well, what was the point? Which is totally the wrong lesson to take from it.
There's so much I could say about it. I mean, I think we live now in a time where, again, because of social media, we have a sense of what other people are doing or what sort of successes they might be enjoying, because we have this little lens into their life and into their world. So inevitably we're comparing our projects to theirs without thinking about maybe what sort of backing they have or what sort of struggles they've had to endure. Like, none of that is framed for us, right? So I do encourage anyone who will listen to me and my friends that I'm close with to put the device down and to just try to find what did one of these Drag Race contestants say that the thing they couldn't live without was their phone? And I just thought, this is a bit depressing. Not that I don't have mine often, quite close at hand, but I think the more we can try to tune that out and focus in on the projects that we're doing and just coming up with some benchmarks of success purely for ourselves that don't maybe even necessarily have to do with the financial return or the number of views, or I mean, all these crazy analytics, right, around any of this stuff. I mean, it sort of is crazy making. If we're deriving joy from it and if it is connecting with other people, I think it's a reason to keep doing it if you have the means to keep doing it. But I also think the other point that's important and is worthwhile is to think about the sort of finances of it. And that's the one thing that I had a difficult time with at that time in the 2000s. Like, I wanted for it to continue to sort of grow and to get better, and for the costumes to get better, and to be able to work with a choreographer, like for it to just sort of keep improving. And there was just no way to really do that because there was no, like, then it's just kind of a expensive hobby.
Yeah, and I mean, that goes back to what you were saying about comparing yourself to others on social media and whatnot. Like, if you're seeing them and it seems to be effortless for them, it probably isn't. It probably is that they've got a fuck ton of money behind them somewhere, or some favors being pulled in, and they're just choosing not to share that information with you. Whilst we're bitching about people on social media, can I just say, I hate when people try to be like, all like, here's something vulnerable, I want to tell you about myself. And it's really just like a total humble brag. It really pisses me off.
I try to spend as little time on social media as possible, because for that exact reason, because I think most of it is very disingenuous. And I also started to listen to some audiobooks and just became aware of certain concepts, which I would encourage people to check out if they're interested, if it resonates with them. A guy named Cal Newport wrote a book called Digital Minimalism. And it talks about how much of a distraction most social media and technology is, so that if there's projects we're trying to make happen or things that we're trying to work on, particularly if they're ambitious, it takes a certain amount of time invested and organization of energy. And so, quite frankly, social media can a lot of the times be a bit of a distraction or a crutch from putting more time and energy into some of the things that we want to be doing, instead of comparing ourselves to what other people are doing.
And whilst we hear Grindr is a total myth, like, it's far more energy to hook up with someone than any other means.
Yes.
I'll just put that out.
Yes.
Yeah, I don't know. It's the whole, the way it's all been engineered to give you a dopamine hit.
Yep.
And even knowing that, just can't get away from it. It's really interesting.
Yeah. Well, and then it all of a sudden became almost compounded due to COVID that we were sort of forced to stay inside, be inside with good reason. I'm here to say I'm the child of parents who are healthcare providers, right? Lifelong healthcare practitioners. I'm in full support of doing what we need to do, but it then almost created even more of a situation where one of the easiest things for us to do was to be on a device, be on a screen, be on social media, and be seeing what everyone else is doing and feeling like their situation's not my situation, or just any of that kind of stuff, right? That's, I think, not necessarily helpful.
No. But addictive nonetheless.
But but it's addictive nonetheless, and so I would encourage people to check out some of Cal Newport's stuff, because it is quite thought provoking, and it's interesting to think back on 2007 as sort of a benchmark year, because I will also say this, and even you asking me this question sort of spurred this thought a little bit. I think one of the things when I reflect on being a burlesque performer and having transitioned, starting out performing sort of drag, femme drag, not really being part of like a traditional drag queen circle per se, but absolutely loving and identifying the sort of fundamentals of drag as a way to sort of explore gender. So I had transitioned by that point, and then I had performed, been a burlesque performer, and I had performed with a burlesque troupe, traveled, performed in other cities with my trans identity not being known. So I think by 2007, I feel like I had maybe done what I needed to do with it. So it was like natural for me to want to say, I didn't necessarily want to reinvest any further. I was totally okay with saying, I'm going to go in a different direction, not because I'm sort of bitter about having maybe like had a show that was a failure. And like, I just was sort of like that. Wow, amazing. Cool. I did it. And now I'm changing gears a little bit.
Are we able to talk? So there's that ongoing tedious conversation at the moment about who is able to perform drag. And I feel like we're kind of coming out the end of that conversation. But did you... Yeah, what were your views then after you transitioned? Were you still considering it drag? Or did the whole thing evolve to a point where it wasn't drag anyway?
It definitely didn't. I didn't think of it as drag or not drag at any point. But you have to imagine in the late 90s and early 2000s, we did not have somebody like Gottmik or, people. I mean, there's been a number of them, which are the most sort of readily, I guess, accessible examples to most people who are maybe watching or consuming popular culture, right, through Drag Race, who are trans performers appearing on Drag Race. There was no examples of it, but I will say that I always just had fun with it. And I consciously wasn't necessarily wanting to be a part of the traditional drag circuit. There was, I think, one night that I was invited to do a performance at the sort of classic, like, high drag in Vancouver, pageants and tiaras kind of weekly party. But I mean, I loved it. I was friends with all those girls. I loved them.
Is the reason that you didn't want to be part of it because it was that high kind of old school version of drag?
I think so, to some extent. And there was a real moment for me that served as a delineation between what I was doing, which was performance and sort of showgirl and cabaret performance was, I guess, how I saw it. I mean, it was lip sync. There was often elements of burlesque being sort of incorporated. And I wasn't setting out to be like a body queen or like a sexy performer. I mean, it was really meant to be sort of playful. Here's a good example. One of the parties we did at Milk was called Slopcore, and it was meant to be as like sort of messy as possible. And I performed.
Were you in a swimming pool with baked beans?
No, definitely not, because I still wanted it to be a little bit polished. I'm sure you've gathered by now that I still, even if it's a bit DIY, I do like it to have a little bit of polish to it. But my performance was a recreation of a whole medley of flash dance songs, culminating in the famous bucket of water dropping on me from above, which we did the whole thing. And even to this day, I think, like, how on earth we poured an entire bucket of water on me on that stage.
Just the thought of getting it wrong terrifies me.
It went off so flawlessly. But so that was, I mean, I was lip syncing, but there was always that element to it.
Yeah.
But the point in time where I was quite conscious of, okay, this is maybe where there are some differences and there's a bit of overlap, but there's differences, is I was cast in the film. I was specifically contacted, asked to be a part of it. The film Connie and Carla.
Oh, I mean, just side note, just talking about humble brags here. Oh, they reached out to me.
No,
they wanted
it's not
me.
I thought it was quite hilarious because at the time it was, so for people who've seen it, it's a movie about two women on the run from the mafia. Have you seen this movie, Kay?
I know what it is, but I haven't seen it. Sorry.
So it's about two cisgender women who go incognito at a drag club to hide out from the mob.
And it's Toni Collette and the woman from My Big Fat Greek Wedding.
Nia Vardalos,
Yes.
Yeah, from My Big Fat Greek Wedding. So, I mean, they wanted, I guess, a range of background drag characters to appear in this club. And my aesthetic wasn't, drag, like really high drag. And all the rest of the featured background drag performers were like the really classic sort of high drag. And so even when we were all sharing our sort of separate dressing room together, to me, it was like being at drag queen summer camp, and I loved it. Like, it was nonstop laugh riot. You can't even imagine that much energy in that one room. But lots of other people in the film were a bit confused as to why there was like some like young girl in with the drag queens, or like what's going on, because I had already begun to transition. So I looked a bit out of place, but I had an absolute ball. I mean, at no point was I really conscious or feeling like, oh, I'm trans identified, I don't belong here. I just thought it was hilarious. Like, I thought it was so much fun, and I got really paid exceptionally well to do that film. Like, it was. And they had recreated this whole nightclub interior that the second you set foot in it, it was all built from scratch. You sort of felt like, oh, I've been to this club. Like, it reminds you of a bunch of different places.
So it smelled of poppers, is that what you're saying?
Well, it smelled kind of smoky and dingy and like sweaty and a bit maybe pea stains.
Oh,
like
okay.
that. I'm sure that was all, like that kind of place.
Oh, I think I've been there, yeah.
Trust me, you'll watch the film and be like, oh my gosh, that reminds me a bit of.
Well, and then so then did you find out? So why were you like? So with, I know how this is going to come off, but why were you cast then if everyone else was high femme?
You'll have to watch the film and you'll make up your own mind, I guess, because I'm quite visible in it, in the nightclub scenes. So there's a part where I push through the girls out of the way. I mean, I had to I don't know, maybe I was supposed to be the like bitchy young drag queen. I wasn't really given like a brief, but we did all have to provide our own costumes. That was part of it. So,
oh, that's interesting.
But then I had also started to grow my hair by that point, quite long. So I was the only one who like had my own hair through a lot of it. I think I had a wig in maybe like one scene. Yeah. And the lead hairdresser who was in charge of the whole drag queen sort of portion of the cast, the background, the gaggle of drag queens was, I'm sure he just saw me and knew exactly what was up. And so he would basically style my hair for each of these scenes. Like, we would just sit and kiki and cackle, and he was this like beautiful older gentleman. I mean, I wish I knew even who he was, what came of him. Maybe he's in the credits. Anyways. And so one of the looks he gave me was very like Patsy and Adina, like this French roll. And he just would basically fuss over my hair. I mean, I was in heaven.
Oh, wow. Imagine. So it's not a gaggle, but what is a group of drag queens called?
Is there an official term?
Well, I want to make up one. Yeah. So I want alliteration. So like a drama of drag queens?
A drama of drag queens. I love it.
Okay. Let's try and make that stick. Yeah.
Let's do it, because there's a murder of crows, isn't there?
Yes. Yeah.
So couldn't there be a drama of drag queens?
Yeah. I think that's going to work. I think that's going to land. So where were we? We were at performing. So it all started in a big explosion of excitement and then fizzled out.
Yeah, and I think that's a good metaphor for it in some ways, because really we started out with all the energy, enthusiasm, and passion in the world, and then it really is difficult to sustain that, right? I mean, especially in nightlife where things can really be hot for like a month and then not. And I've definitely been a part of other parties that had these phenomenal runs, some of which were longer, some of which were quite short. But people's tastes and appetite for certain kinds of event can change quite quickly. And especially in a smaller city, it's not like there's a huge sort of population of people that it might sort of ebb and flow between. It's sort of like it has its moment and then the moment's passed. But the space was just so exceptionally beautiful when we, first stepped into it. And then they made a few aesthetic changes too as time went by, because I think that it wasn't really taking off in the way that they had hoped. So like nothing really compares to just that initial like relaunch of a space, so fresh after the renovation, the, whole resurfacing, polishing, buffing. It's only going to go downhill from there, isn't it? Like,
well, I don't know, because you do get to a point where it's scuzzy and gross and like home again. Yeah. And that's exciting.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do think that that's what I hope. I just would hope people that are listening to these kinds of podcasts and stories and getting a bit hung up on the nostalgia component of it are like taking some notes, because I think my hope with all this is to say that post-COVID and in some not too distant future that there will be parties again in cool spaces, quirky spaces, non-traditional spaces. I just think right now for most people that I know who are involved in nightlife, it's a really sort of dour, sort of dark time a little bit. And nightlife in particular is going to be one of the last things, lots of people say, like people, gathering and DJs dancing, any of that kind of stuff can seem like a long ways away, right? From where we are currently. I think it has the potential to come just, surging back, but
yeah, everyone's talking about this roaring 20s. The next decade is going to be total hedonism. One of the things that I want to see more of, I want to see that embracing of just total sloppiness again. Like, that's just disappeared because we all have to be perfect on social media.
Yeah.
So now, like, you go to a performance, everything is perfect. Everything is just like rehearsed to the nth degree. I like that kind of spontaneity and scrappiness. And I want to see more of that.
Well, and I think that was when I look back on the posters and flyers, when I think back on that time period, I mean, I definitely wanted to try to bring some polish to it, but I was by no means trying to necessarily eradicate the grittiness of it either, right? And I also think that that's sort of where a lot of magic can happen, is when you've got a bit of grit and a bit of glamour happening sort of simultaneously. It's what I love about New York, is that New York is both exceptionally glamorous and also just like kind of filthy.
Stanky. Yeah.
But I agree with you. I think to have some polish and some glamour and some preparation, but also to be open to spontaneity, bit of dinginess, bit of griminess, bit DIY.
Yeah, because I think that's the things that are too polished. You're polishing away the joy. Oh God, did I just say
Yes,
that? You know what I mean?
absolutely.
And just that joy is so infectious, and it's a real shame when it's lost. Do you have any memories of Vancouver clubbing that you would like to share? Or do you want to just reach out for a chat or with a suggested space for a future episode? Well, either way, I would love to hear from you. You can reach me on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook with the username KAndersonMusic. And make sure you also follow Jordan on Instagram whilst you're there. Her username is Jordan King Archive. You can also listen to Jordan's show Radio Never Apart, and I'll be sure to leave a link in the show notes for this episode. Lost Spaces is not only a podcast, but a concept record as well. I have been writing songs about queer venues and the people who used to live their lives there, and will be releasing songs over the next year. You can hear the first single, Well Groomed Boys, which is also playing underneath my talking right this very second on all good streaming platforms. If you liked this episode, I would really appreciate if you subscribed, left a review on Apple Podcasts, or just told people who you think might be interested in giving it a little listen too. I am Kay Anderson, and you have been listening to Lost Spaces.